Alright guys, this is part 4 of my video tutorial series working with the Blender exporter tool created by user Boo342. So let's just dive in. Here we go. Okay everybody, in today's video we're going to be adding textures to our robot walker model that we rigged in the last video and added this bones armature to the robot. But in today's video we're going to be adding textures as well. We're going to be creating a couple of animation sequences. We're going to create an idle animation sequence as well as a walk cycle. And I'm going to be going through all the steps needed for us to do that. And then in the last part of the video, we're going to export the model once again and load it up in the preview program CHORIZO, where we'll be able to view the textures as well as the animation sequences and verify that we have everything exported properly. That will be today's video. So before we begin, we actually have to apply a loop cut onto the head object up here. And the reason that we need to do that is because we need to divide this so that we have multiple faces, because this head object is actually quite large for the textures that we're going to be applying to it. One important thing that you got to realize about the N64 and when you're creating models for the N64, the reality is that it uses a very, very small area of memory for storing its textures. And that's called TMEM. And so with the fact that this is a really small area of memory, the texture sizes in turn also have to be very, very small. So most N64 textures are usually 32 by 32 pixels in size, so really, really small. And so the textures that we're going to be applying to this today are going to be a combination of 32 by 32 pixels as well as 32 by 64. And so those are just really small image sizes that we're going to be using, and you can create those in programs like Photoshop or even Windows Paint. So we select the head object here, and then we press Tab to go into edit mode. And now we make sure we have face select up here. Select one of the faces, and then what we're going to do is press Ctrl R, and that applies the loop cut option. And so we're going to apply a loop cut right here down the center. We double click essentially, and then we'll press Ctrl R again, and we're going to do one on the horizontal as well. So we single click and then click again. So we'll hit Tab to go into object mode. We'll select the neck object, then we'll press Tab to go into edit mode. We select faces, and we'll select one of the faces here, and then we're going to press Ctrl R. And we're actually going to apply the loop cut right about there where it's selected. So we'll single click, and then this allows us to designate where we want the loop cut. So we're actually going to apply it right about here. And we press Tab to go back into object mode, and done. So now before we can begin to apply textures to our robot, we actually need some textures that we can use. So now you can do one of two things. You can scour the internet for different sources of textures that you can use, or you can just go and create your own using a program like Photoshop or even Windows Paint if you wanted. Now again, because the N64 uses such a small texture size, it will be kind of difficult to find websites that are actually hosting N64 textures specifically. But you can find all sorts of free resources on the internet, which you can use to, resize and rescale and create your own textures as you need. I recommend websites like polyhaven.com or textures.com, as most of those are free to use. However, just make sure that you confirm the proper licensing and confirm that you are allowed to use them. So now I've made my own textures for this robot in Photoshop, and I spent a good amount of time going through all the different tools that were in Photoshop, all the different brushes, and a lot of the different effects. And I managed to go through and create a whole series of different textures for this robot walker. And so now you can feel free to use those if you want, and I'll include a link in the description for you to download. And then during the tutorial, I'll get you to use those, and we're going to apply those to our robot model. And again, I'll include a link in the description for you. So once you've downloaded the textures file, so here is the file that you're going to download, that zip file there, robomech-textures.zip. So just save that to your local C drive and extract it into a folder that you're going to be referencing there very shortly. So just make sure you have those ready to go. So the next step, we're going to go up to the top menu here and we're going to select shading. So we'll click on that and it opens up this viewport here, as you can see. And so this user perspective view, you're going to have to actually zoom out a little bit. So we'll just zoom out with our scroll wheel here in our mouse. And that way we can see our model. And we just make sure we have the head object selected. And then what you're going to do in this view is press / on your keyboard. And what that does is it places the view into what's called local view. And that just essentially only shows the selected object in the viewport while you're editing and applying textures to it. So then in the lower section of the screen here, this is the area where we're going to be editing and applying the textures and all the different nodes and filters, that kind of thing, which are called shaders. So the first thing you need to do is go over to this new button here. We're going to add a new material. And this is the default set of nodes that you get. Now this principled BSDF shader, you can actually just select it and then hit delete because we're not going to be using that. The next thing you need to do is go up to add. So we go over here and click on add, and then we're going to go down to shader, and then we're going to go up here to diffuse BSDF. And then your mouse has this little shader node that we can then click and place anywhere in this area. And now what we're going to do is connect these two together. Now this is the final output, which will then be applied to the selected object. So what you're going to do is just single click on this little dot here, this green dot. You're going to drag a line over to surface, and that's going to essentially connect these two nodes together. Now what we're going to do is correct the roughness level to 0.5, and we hit enter. And now what we need to do is add an image texture node to this. So what we do is we go up here and we click add, and then we select texture, and then we select image texture. And then we place this node right about here, and now we're going to connect this color output to the color input on the diffuse BSDF. So now this is essentially the layout that we're going to be using, and we're going to be using these for all the different objects in our model. This is essentially the setup that we're going to be using. Now this one here is just for this material object here. Now we're going to rename this to head. And that's the material name that we've just assigned it there, and that's only going to be used for the head object. So now we are going to add the PNG texture file, and that's the file that you downloaded from the link that I provided. So now we'll go open, and so you're just going to go ahead and select head.png and then say open image. So you might notice that the texture appears to be a little bit diffused, but that's okay. This is part of the process, and we're going to be correcting this once we've applied all the textures to all the different objects that make up our model. So now we're going to click on the neck object. So once we click that, you'll notice how all of the settings here that we had, all the different nodes for that material, for the head material, have disappeared. And that's because we have changed the object that we selected. If we were to select the head object again, they reappear. So just keep that in mind. So we have the neck object selected, so we'll go down here and create a new material. So we click new, and again we delete principled BSDF because we don't need it. We'll go over here to add, go to shader, and then select diffuse BSDF, place that next to the material output, connect the two nodes together, and then we go add, and then we select texture, and then image texture. And as well, we're going to connect those two nodes together as shown here. And then we go open. And so this time we're going to select the neck PNG file. And so neck and legs, because we're actually using the same texture for all the different sections in the legs. So we'll go ahead and select that neck legs PNG file and go open. and we'll make sure we change the roughness level to 0.5, and then everything looks good. And now we just simply rename this texture to neck legs. Enter. There we go. So now in this drop-down menu here, we can see we have both of those materials that we can select. So now we simply repeat the same process for each of the objects and then apply a texture PNG image file. So our next step is to reset what's called the UV mapping for each of our objects, and that's the reason that the textures don't really appear correctly on our model. And so, as I mentioned before, this was something that we need to correct. So we actually have to go in to the settings and reset the way that the textures are mapped to all of the faces for each of the objects. And we need to correct this by resetting the UV mapping settings. And so we do that by going into the UV editing tab up here at the top. So we'll go ahead and click on that. And so this is the view that you'll get when you first enter the UV editing window. So you got to zoom out here in the perspective view. So we'll just shift things along here a little bit, shift it down so we can see our model a little better. And we'll actually change over here to our textured view. And then we'll zoom in here on our texture. Now this is just a preview window here on the left. You can go in and select all of the different texture images that you have assigned to your model. This window here on the left, this is essentially just a preview of the UV map. And you're able to select different textures, and then the UV map of the object you have selected is essentially just overlaid over top of that image, allowing you to preview it to see how it is actually mapped if you were to select that specific texture. Now, when you switch to object mode here in the perspective view, and if you select an object and then you hit tab, and then you hit 3 on the keyboard to go to face select. Now whenever you select any of the faces for that particular object, you can see over here on the preview window here for the texture that you have selected, it will show you how this face on the object that you have selected, it will actually show you which section of the loaded texture that you have will appear on that object if you were to go and assign this texture to that object. So again, it's just a preview window. So it's just showing you the cutout of how it looks. So now if we put our cursor over top of that, we hit L to select all faces, you can now see how all of the different faces that make up that head object are currently laid out here and how this cutout is assigned. So only this section of the texture is being applied to one face, and you have all of the separate faces here. And so that was the reason why the texture appeared kind of blurry in that. It's because we have not actually assigned the entire texture to each face. So in order to do that, so that the entire texture is used for each face individually, we have to run through a process of resetting it. And so we simply do that by having the object selected in edit mode, and then we highlight all of the faces, and then we press U on the keyboard, and then we have this UV mapping menu, and then right at the bottom here you have reset. So whenever you click on that now, if we were to go back into object mode, you can now see that each of the faces that make up that head object now have this entire texture image assigned to each face. So now we're going to go ahead and reset this for each of the objects in our model. So if we were to select the neck object, we simply hit tab, to go into edit mode. And then we hit 3 on the keyboard to make sure we have the face select option selected. And then we can select one of the faces on the model. And then if you just have your cursor over top of the object and then press L, that will select all of the faces on the object. And again, with your cursor in this window, you press U, and then you select reset. Alright, so we're now at the point where we can start to add different animation sequences to our model. So the first thing we need to do is select the animation tab. So we go up here to the top and we select animation. So this is the viewport here that you're going to get. So obviously we're zoomed in here because our model is so large, we have to zoom out just to bring it in view. And then we can do the same for this preview window here. Now in this left window here, if you press and hold Alt and then use your scroll wheel and single click into different areas on the screen, you can actually move it around and change the perspective view. So that's just a good little trick here. And then you can zoom in with the scroll wheel. So next we're going to select the viewport shading drop-down menu at the top here. And what we're going to do is under the color heading, we're going to select texture. Also, what we're going to do is we're going to activate the shadow option as well as cavity. And then for the type, we're going to select both. Now, one thing we're going to do as well, and that is under the world space and screen space, we're just going to increase everything up to the max. And essentially all that's going to do is just make the model appear a little more crisp in our user perspective window. So again, we'll go up here to the viewport shading drop-down menu and we'll activate textures under color. As well, we'll activate both shadow and cavity. Type we'll set to both. And then under world space and screen space, we'll just increase everything up here just to give it a nice crisp look. So now we're ready to begin adding keyframes. So we'll begin by adding an idle animation. So to start, we'll select the armature and press Control Tab, and that will bring us into pose mode. So there you can see we're in pose mode now. Also, what we're going to do is press Shift C, and that's going to bring our 3D cursor down to the world origin point. Next, under the dope sheet heading, we're going to use this drop-down menu here and change this to Action Editor. And this is essentially where we're going to be adding our keyframes. So the first thing we're going to do is press this new button, and that's going to create a new action sequence for us, or a new animation sequence. And we're going to rename this to 0 T-Pose. And that's just sort of the default name, especially if you're creating humanoid characters. Now for the start and end frames, we're going to set this from 1 to 30. So we have a start frame as 1 and we'll change the end point to 30. Enter. So now we can stretch this out so that we can see all the frames in our viewport here, and we do that by just grabbing the endpoints of this little slide bar at the bottom. And if you just drag this over, you'll see how it stretches out. And then you can grab both ends and just sort of slide them over so that you have the full frame range in view. Now we're going to lock this T-pose by activating the fake user shield icon, and that's right here. So we'll just single click and that's going to lock that in place. And all that means is that it's just protected and we won't accidentally delete anything. So to add keyframes to our model, we need to select the armature, and we just make sure that we're in pose mode, and we'll select the root bone here. And then if you press A, that's going to select all of the bones in our armature. And with our cursor here in the 3D viewport, we press I, and that's going to open up the Insert Keyframe menu. And then what we're going to do is go down here and select location and rotation and activate that. And then you're going to see here at the bottom how all the keyframes for each of our bone structure has been applied for frame 1. And so that's essentially just recording the current position and saving those into frame 1. All right, so we're going to create our idle animation sequence now. So we do that by going over here to this icon, new action, and we'll click on that. And essentially what it does, it just creates a duplicate of the previous action sequence that we had created, but it just assigns this little suffix here to it. But we can rename this. So we're going to call this idle. The next thing we need to do is go down here at the bottom and activate auto keying, this little record button. So we'll activate that, and that essentially will automatically create a keyframe once we start to position the bone's armature into different locations based on which frame we have selected on our timeline down here. And now this is where inverse kinematics comes into play, and it's really, really helpful. So when you select one of the bones here, so as an example, we'll select the root bone. And when we start to position, so all of the bones are being tracked here, and their positions are going to be saved into that keyframe for frame 1. And so with inverse kinematics in place, it just saves us a lot of time, so we don't have to actually go and position each of the bones individually one at a time. So it's a huge time saver. So now we'll switch to our front view by hitting numpad 1, and we're going to hit grab. So what we're going to do is bring this down, lock it there, hit numpad 3, and we'll hit grab and bring this back a little bit. And now when we change our perspective here, we can also use our target and pull bones, and we can position the legs into a specific position for frame 1. So now what we're going to do is maybe we're going to widen the legs here. So we'll grab the target bone here, and what we can do is hit X, and that's going to allow us to slide the leg over a little bit just so that it's a little bit wider. And we'll do the same for the right leg. And we'll grab the left leg pull bone here and just sort of shift them around a little bit, not too much. So this current position for the robot right now has been saved as keyframe for frame number 1. So we'll zoom out here a little bit, change your perspective. Now, if we hit the play button, you'll notice that it's cycling through all of the 30 frames, but there's no action happening here. And that's because we only have the first position. So we'll go ahead and hit pause. So now let's change this. We'll go halfway and we'll move to frame 15 on the timeline. And so now what we're going to do is just make very slight changes. Because this is our idle animation sequence, you want to just have it sort of moving back and forth very, very slightly. So we'll grab the pull bone here and we'll shift this down just a little bit. Maybe shift it over. And as you can see, the keyframes have already been assigned. Now we'll go to a side view and let's select the head bone. Go back to a front view and we'll press R. And now we'll just drag this down here so we have a little bit more of a fine control. And we're just going to give the head a slight turn, a very subtle turning motion here. Not much at all. That's good there. Control 1, and that will give us a rear view. And now we're going to grab the root bone, hit grab, and we're just going to give that a slight shift, not much at all. And then maybe grab the pull bone here for each leg and bring them in a little bit. Again, very subtle movements. So now what we're going to do is we're going to copy the keyframes in frame 1 and we're going to paste that onto frame 30. So the first thing we need to do is in our perspective window here, we're going to select one of the bones. We have our root bone selected. Now I press A, and that's going to select all the bones in our armature. And now you can see all of the keyframes for frame 1 are visible. So now what we're going to do is bring our cursor down here into the action editor window, and we're going to press A twice. And now what we do is we press B, and that's going to provide us with a box select. And what we can do now is just drag a box over all of those keyframes and drag it down past the scroll bar here, and that will assume that you want to select all keyframes even if they're out of view. So then you release, and so now if we were to go over here and scroll down, you can see that all of these have been selected and they're all in the yellow color. So now we'll drag this back up, and now what we do is we press Ctrl+C, and that has now copied all of these selected keyframes for frame 1. And with our cursor here on the timeline at frame 30, we just simply hit Ctrl+V to paste. And so now when we can change our perspective view here, zoom out a little bit, and now if we hit play, and there you can see all of the keyframes. Just sort of like this bobbing action for the robot. Now you can go in and you know, polish this up a little bit if you wish. You can add more keyframes or change things around as you see fit. But that's basically our idle animation sequence. So we're going to create our walk cycle animation now. So we'll go over here and click New Action, create the new animation sequence. So we're going to rename this, and we're going to call this Walk. So we'll select the root bone, hit A to select all, and then down here in the action editor window, we'll hit A twice, and then we'll press B for box select. And then what we're actually going to do is select all of the frames for frame 15 and 30, and make sure you go down past the scroll bar here to select all of them, release. And then what you're going to do is press delete, the delete key, and then say delete keyframes. And so that's just going to keep all the keyframes for frame 1 only and delete all the keyframes from frame 15 and 30. So now I've created a front and side view reference image for the robot walk cycle that you can use to properly position the robot for each of the selected keyframes. So you can go ahead and download that. I'll have a link in the description for you. And that file is called robomechwalkcycle.zip. And so you'll just save that to your local C drive and extract those images, and we're going to be importing those into our scene here the same way that we did for the character robot turnaround. So in our perspective view here, we'll just change this to object mode, and then we're going to hit 1 on the numpad to switch to front view. So now before we start importing our reference images into the scene, we just have to make sure that you deactivate the auto keying option here. So just make sure you turn that off. So now what we're going to do is drag the robot walk cycle front image into our scene. We'll just drop it there. Now you can see it's a very small image, so we actually have to zoom in here. We'll just select it, make sure it's selected, and press S to scale. And then we're going to bring that up. And now we'll hit G to grab. Shift it over, it's there, S to scale, bring it up, and we'll try to match it as best we can to the current size. So you can see that I have keyframe positions here for the robot for the front view for frames 1, 7, 14, 21, and 30. So now what we're going to do is we're going to be starting with frame 1. So we're going to grab this and we're going to try and position it exactly in line with the origin point here, the world origin point, and we're going to try and scale this up as best we can. One thing you're going to notice, we change the perspective here, you'll see how it's sort of halfway through our robot. So again, we're going to need to shift this behind the robot so that we can properly position our robot and not interfere with that reference image. So we'll change to a side view, numpad 3. So we'll select the reference image, hit G to grab, and then select Y for the Y-axis. We're going to drag this way back here. We're just behind the robot, and release. Then we'll switch back to our front view. Now we'll zoom in here, and what I've found is a good way to size this up is to use the spheres as sort of a good reference for size comparison when we're just trying to scale this up. So we just make sure we have the reference image selected again, and we'll hit S to scale. And we're going to bring this up, scale it up until we think that those spheres are at a good size. G to grab, shift it over again. And that's starting to look, so we'll hit S, scale it up, and drag. It's about there, I would think. So then once you find you have it at a good size, you can then try to position it directly in line with that world origin point as best you can. And again, it's just a reference, so it doesn't have to be exact. So this is frame 1, so we now have frame 1 properly positioned for the front view. So now we're going to switch to a side view. And now we're going to bring in the side view reference image. So now we have robot walk cycle side. And we're going to drag that in, drop it right about here. And again, we have to zoom in. So we'll zoom in here just because, again, we had scaled the robot up so much here. So now we'll drag this down and bring it up. Zoom out a little bit. S to scale. Oh, there we go. We'll shift it over to frame 1 and line it up as best we can. And the size of the bones armature here, you can see how they're pretty similar. It might be just a little bit larger, so I'll scale it up just a little bit more. That's probably good. But you can always go in and tweak this if you find you need to. But again, it's just a reference image for position, so it doesn't have to be that perfect, but just try to match it up as best you can. So that's lined up pretty good. However, we still need to shift the reference image over. So we'll go to a front view and we have our reference image selected. So we'll press G to grab on the X-axis and we'll slide this over to about here. And we'll just give some room if we need to change our perspective to view the robot from this side. So that's good there. So we have our front view and our side view, and that's for frame 1. And we have the world origin point there matched up as best we can. Okay, so now what we're going to do is save the reference images to a new collection. So we're just going to drag this down a little bit. So we have both of our images here that we imported. So this one here we have selected is our front view. So let's rename this to robot front. And then the second one here is our side view. So we'll rename that to robot side. And now what we're going to do with that selected, in our perspective window here, we just make sure we have that selected and we hit M to move to collection. And we'll say new collection and we'll say walk cycle ref. Okay, and so now we'll select the front reference image and press M to move. And then we'll just select here walk cycle ref. Now we have that. Both of those images are now in that collection, which we can hide from view whenever need be. Okay, so once we have the reference images set to a size that we're comfortable with, we're going to switch back to pose mode. So what we're going to do is select the bones armature while we're in object mode, and then we're going to press Control Tab, and that brings us into pose mode. So we just make sure that we have the root bone selected and confirm that we are on frame 1. And now make sure that you go down and activate auto keying by pressing that record button. We have to activate that. So we're going to start with the side view for frame 1. So we're going to hit numpad 3. And then we select the root bone and we press G to grab. And now we're going to start to position the root bone to match the reference image in the background as best we can. So we're going to bring that down to about here, and then we'll hit R to rotate. And you can see how we're going to try to position that and match it up as best we can. And you can see how the scale is slightly off, but again, this is just as a reference, so it's not really that critical. Now we'll just zoom in here a little bit and shift this down just so we have a better view. So now what I've done to help you, just so you can see it a little better, is I've left the left leg bones armature as the color gray. So what we're going to do, this is our left leg bones armature here, so we're going to grab the target bone for the left leg, and we're going to hit G to grab, and we're going to try and match that up as best we can over top of the gray armature bone. So we'll just release that, and now when we grab the right leg, we can try to match that up as best we can as well. And now again, if it's not exactly perfect, it's not a big deal, because again, this is just a reference image. So you just use your own discretion and use it as a guide to place it. So now we'll switch to the front view. So we'll hit numpad 1. And this is pretty close. So we're going to shift these bones over a little bit. As you can see, it's selected here. We'll hit G to grab on the X-axis. So then that way we can slide the leg over to where it needs to be. And so that's about here. So we're probably going to have to shift this leg over here. So if we go to a side view, and we have our pull bones here that we can select, and we'll select the right pull bone, go back to the front view, and you can see we have that selected here, and we'll hit G to grab, and then we can shift this over a little bit, right about there. That's good there. We'll actually grab the root bone here and shift this down just a little bit, about there. That's a decent match. Okay, and then we'll switch back to a side view, and we'll grab the left pull bone, go to a front view. You can see we have it selected there. Hit G to grab. We can shift this, give it a little bit of a shift, and we'll do the leg bone as well for the left leg. Go back to a front view, hit G to grab on the X-axis. We'll slide that leg over, right about there, I believe. And we'll hit G to grab. And that's the pull bone there. G to grab. That's pretty good there. I'm comfortable with that. So again, it's just for reference. So you just try to match it up as best you can. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but you just do it the best you can. Front view, side view. So that's pretty good. I'm comfortable with that. Okay, so now we're ready to move on to frame 7. So before you proceed to start shifting the reference images, we need to turn off the auto keying. So that's a critical step. You got to make sure you do that. Otherwise, you're going to actually start to have movement happening here with your reference images. So you just want to make sure that you have auto keying turned off. So now what we're going to do is change to object mode, and we're going to select the reference image here. And then what we're going to do is hit G to grab, and then we hit X for the X axis. And then we're going to slide the reference image over to frame 7. And again, we just do this as best we can. Get it lined up. And we'll hit numpad 3 to go to the side view. And we're going to do the same for the side reference image. So we select the side reference image, hit G to grab. For this axis, we hit Y. And we're going to slide that over, line up the world origin point as best we can to that Cartesian plane, and release. So down here on the timeline under the action editor, we're going to drag our selected frame over to frame 7. Alright, so now what we're going to do is in object mode, we're going to select the bones armature, and then we're going to hit Control Tab to go into pose mode. And now we're going to activate the auto keying. So we press that little record button. So now we're going to repeat the process of moving the bones into the appropriate position for frame 7. Now, a good trick is to use the pull and target bones and move the right leg out of view while you try to position the left leg. And you're going to do that first. Then you can proceed to position the right leg. This just makes it a little bit easier to see the reference image position. So we're going to grab the right leg target bone, hit G to grab, and we're just going to bring this up out of view here temporarily. And so now we can use the target bone for the left leg. So we'll hit G to grab, and we'll just try to position that as best we can to match that armature there for the bones image. So now we can also hit rotate. So we'll hit R to rotate. We're going to shift that a little bit. And we'll hit G to grab, so we're going to bring this up here a little bit. And that's actually shifted there. So you can see in the reference image that there's a tilt there that I've added. So we're going to actually add a tilt here. We're going to rotate the root bone slightly, like that. And now the head has been rotated as well. So we'll select the head bone and hit R to rotate, and we're going to shift that up a little bit. About there. And so we'll select the target bone for the right leg, and we're going to bring that one down and try to position here as best we can. So now if we go to a front view, so we got to shift this over a little bit. So we'll hit the root bone, hit G to grab, and shift this over a little bit. And now there's a tilt there on that root bone. So we're going to tilt this a little bit. So we'll hit R to rotate and turn this over just a little bit, give it a little bit of a tilt. G to grab, bring that up a little bit. Yeah, that's pretty good. I'm comfortable with that. That's a pretty decent position. So let's move ahead and perform this for the remainder of the keyframes for frames 14, 21, and 30. Just don't forget to turn off or turn on the auto keying option using that little record button, because you just want to make sure that you don't have the auto keying enabled when you're shifting the reference image to the different keyframes. So just make sure you remember to do that. Okay, so we've just completed frame 30, and I think that that's a pretty decent position here, copying that reference image. So we've deactivated the auto keying, and if we go back to object mode, and now we're just going to hide the reference image here, so we can just go and hide that from view. And now we can zoom out, change our perspective here a little bit, and now if we activate this, so that looks pretty good. So now we're ready to export this to the Sausage64 format. Now, however, before you do that, so we'll hit pause here. Before you actually export this, you have to make sure that the armature is visible, because if you have that hidden, the exporter will cause errors. So just again, make sure you have this enabled. So we just navigate up here to File menu, select Export, Sausage64 character format, and it will then prompt us for our destination folder of where we want to save the output S64 format file. And we'll just hit save. And there you can see at the bottom, file exported successfully. And there in Windows Explorer, you can see that the Sausage64 formatted file has been successfully exported. So we're going to load that now into CHORIZO. So we activate CHORIZO, and we'll bring this up here. And then we'll go File, Import S64 formatted file. Select our exported file, open, and there's our model. And now you can see that we have the textures are present as well as the animation sequences. Now we still have to add the textures to this model. So we'll go over here to the textures heading. We'll select the head texture, and we just make sure we have image selected. Now there's all these options here that you can customize if you want, but right now we'll just leave those as the default. And now we'll click on this little image icon, and we'll navigate to our textures folder. And we have the head object selected, so we select head.png. And we'll just move through for the rest of those textures. So there we go, we have our textures applied. And now if we navigate down here to the animations heading and select each of the individual animation sequences, you can see that we have a preview happening here. Select our walk cycle, and there we have it. So we'll just go ahead and pause this. And the last step that we need to do is to export our texture definitions with the applied textures. So we hit export, and we'll save it here. And we're going to call this RoboMech Text Def, and then save. And so there's our exported file there. And this is going to be one of the files that we need when we're using some of the command line tools as part of the compilation process, where we will be creating the N64 preview ROM and then running that on the N64 console. But that will be in the next video. So there we have it. We successfully added textures to this model, and we also created the idle and walk cycle animation sequences. So that's pretty awesome. So thanks again for watching, everybody, and we will see you in the next video. Take it easy, and bye for now. Ciao.